Now we're going to move on to the next theme. It's regulation of regulatory. Well, it's about developments of the regulatory framework for the market investment funds. Mrs. Roberta Davis, Alex, thank you, Roberta. Ms. Karen Fiol, Vice President CIF. Alexander Koch, Head of the Distribution and Client Distribution Relationship, AFG. Mr. Charles Lacoste, Chief Executive Officer, Cheyenne Capital, and also Mr. Frédéric Pelez, Executive Director of the Regulatory Policy and International Affairs Director at AMF. You're welcome, and thank you for coming this morning. Thank you. I'd like to talk with you, Alexander Koch, a recognized expert in your field. You steered the EFG Commission. Can you talk about regulations? What is the present situation in terms of brainstorming about that? Thank you. I represent AFG, the French professional organization representing asset management, IRIS. This is a subject we've talked about, of course, as soon as the Commission's proposals were published and also beforehand to prepare all of this. Of course, the objective, the general one for us, is to increase participation of retail investors. It's a general objective that we totally support, of course. And if we look at what we have in this project, of course, there are positive things which go along those lines. Financial education, that was already mentioned. And there are other items like EMFIDD, which was mentioned too. That's a very important point. And then if we look at the text more closely, we see there's the FG part, which is focused on 3 points. I'll get back to them in a second. But before that, as a preliminary remark, what struck us very quickly was the very strong focus on the text, on the costs and the fees. And as for our members, this calls for several comments. First of all, the fees, and this is undoubtedly one of the elements that has to be taken into account if we're talking about a financial product and its relevance for investors. But this is only one element among others. Of course, we have to look at the performance. We have to look in detail at the type of management and a whole series of characteristics which are qualitative or quantitative in terms of types of management, in terms of liquidity, capital protection, and so ESG, and so on and so on. So this is a holistic approach, which is necessary, and it's a case-by-case approach focused on the client's needs, and not only an approach focused on the product itself. And the second thing is this, if we're talking about cost, I think it's important to stress this. It's that the price of the products, the savings products, the price of funds has already dropped in recent years, and we see this in France and in Europe. We have AMF statistics, and this drop is important to point out. You see this in the funds which are actively managed, and this is a general setting. And now, as for the other points that we've noted, there is the partial prohibition, and this was mentioned in the text. It's not desirable, this prohibition, and we've seen this. And this is an important point, however, namely, even if this ban is partial, the European Commission has provided for a clause of entailing a review in 3 years. So this review clause over 3 years, this is a point that we're fighting on in the FG. And there's another subject, the best interest test. It aims at setting up obligations for counselors and investment. You have to act in the best interest of the client. So far, we all agree on this, but concretely in this text, we have 3 cumulative conditions. I'm not going to go into detail, but these obligations are not always clear, and they're not clear, and they're excessively based on cost. And lastly, the last point for major focus, the value for money. That's value for money. And it has to be pointed out this concept of value for money is the following. We have to make sure that the product has a added value for the investor and the market players. It's the European Commission for various reasons to another proposal. I will go into detail about that later. Mr. Charles Lacroix, Chief Executive Officer, Chain Capital. What would you say about all this? Good morning, everybody. Chain Capital. Maybe most of you don't know it. A few words about it. I'd like to tell you a word about us. And our company is a management company. We manage assets, shares, and we're very active. We're part of the Iris Finance International Group. We're based in Luxembourg. We have a branch in Paris. We sell products in Europe with a clientele which is historically institutional, but we are referenced with big players. So the IRIS directive will have an impact on us. As for the scenario, let me pick up on what our friend just said, what is going to happen next. When I reread the European directive and the text, I agree with what you said. I see a temporization about this ban by the European Union. It's clearly written that because of the disturbances, which are very strong, the disturbances that would be caused by this in the industry, the Commission proposes a gradual approach. So the central scenario of the Commission is that this ban will take place, and we cannot rule out this possibility. And there's another player, the Iris Finance International Group. We don't have a specific distribution network. This might be for an opportunity for us as performance. There's a diversified side for diversified products. This can be the only criterion, but at the same time, there's another effect, as you stress, and other speakers have too. But there's the advisory gap. This is risk too. We don't have any perspective on this yet. This would mean this gap for management companies. We would mean we don't control the situation of direct fund distribution. These companies don't have this mass marketing culture, and it's quite logical. It's logical in our communication, which is quite limited. It's not like we're selling Coca-Cola, so communication is the message that has to be synthetic in order to be effective. So this is a problem. How can we achieve this? And lastly, and this goes back to the question of financial education, the average people have to have a certain financial culture in order to decide whether a product is good or not. The IRIS directive, then, aside from pious wishes about financial education, well, in fact, these courses of financial education would be necessary, and this would be very important, financial education. Then, as for CGP, we already are working on this in France. We have CGP being worked on by different companies. So there are creations now of oligopolies which are not beneficial. As for Italy now, we have Mrs. Roberta Aptis.
Thank you very much to be here and to share with us the position of Italian asset managers on these discussed issues of the retail investment strategy. Does Assogestioni support the objectives of the retail investment strategy that aim at promoting investors' confidence?
Thank you, firstly, for inviting me to this edition of Fund Distribution Breakfast. This is, for me, a great opportunity to share with you the Assogestioni position, the position of Italian asset managers. Let me say right away that our position goes in the same way, way of EFAMA, and also FG, so we are the industry of asset manager. In general, also we support the objectives of the retail investment strategy aiming at promoting investor confidence and participation to the capital market. In particular, we welcome, among others, the intention to align the investor protection framework for insurance company, investment firms, and asset management company. This is a very important goal of this framework. Regarding the inducements, the two topics for us, the political topics are the inducement and the value for money. And so regarding the inducements, also we welcome the decision to not introduce a total ban of inducement, and so to preserve the two distribution models that are in Europe, the commission-based and the fee-based model. But however, we have some concern, as EFAMA and FJ said before, on some aspects of the inducement proposal. For example, the different wording used in the European Commission for the ban of inducement in portfolio management services. Because which could result in the possibility of paying and receive inducement for the marketing by the distribution of portfolio management services provided by the asset manager. And this could be a big impact for the Italian market. I think also for the other market, but for the Italian market could be a critical point. The other point is relating to the transaction advice approach. We agree, we welcome the partial ban regarding the exemption to the advice, because it's very important that there is an exemption for the ban of inducement where the distributor provided advice. But according to the Italian distribution, the using in the proposal, the European proposal of the transaction advice for the single operation could be a problem, because our model is based on a full advice, is a portfolio advice. And so we try to interpret broadly, no, the wording of a transaction advice that the European Commission provided in the proposal. So, as FJ said before, the condition under which Commission may continue to be paid according to best interest could be a problem. This is the condition on letter B and C is very cost-oriented. And finally, the provision relating to the short period of the revision is very short. And so this is the main point regarding inducements. If you wanted only for value for money,
it's good to listen to you. Let's develop.
Okay, regarding the value for money, obviously we support the introduction of a measure designed to ensure the value for money of financial instruments, so it is a good thing. We also agree with the Commission proposal to consider the value for money test as an additional internal test for both manager and distributors. So not only for the manufacturer, but also for the distributors. So the value for money test is an obligation for the manufacturer, but also for the distributor, for the manufacturer for the product, and for the distributor for the service they provide. This is a good point. However, as FJ and EFAMA said before, we believe that the Commission decision to establish objective criteria for the assessment.
With the microphone, please.
Okay. So the decision to establish the objective criteria for the assessment of value for money using European benchmark of ESMA, developed by ESMA, EIOPA, to compare product cost and performance is extremely complex and poses at least 3 risks, according to us. The first one is the risk of not capturing the specificity of the product and services provided, the risk of lowering the quality of product and services offered due to the obligation to comparison with a predefined benchmark, and the last one is the risk of impairing healthy competition among the European market. Because since there are no other legislation that have introduced a pricing process through the imposition or comparison with a benchmark developed by an authority. So could be impaired the competition according to us among the European market. This is the way because we are at Assogestioni, but also with EFAMA working on alternative approach on value for money. We think that manufacturer and distributor should perform an internal value assessment, but in according to not a European benchmark, as I said before, but a European methodology is a different approach. That should be developed by European Commission or ESMA or EIOPA, but is a methodology. What means? The European methodology should establish, among others, the criteria, only the criteria to determine whether costs and charges are justified and proportionate, as the European proposal said, but also the criteria to be taken into account in carrying out the internal asset value assessment of value for money, the internal value assessments, and the cost governance, and the cost control to be adopted by manufacturers and distributors. Okay, according to us, the European methodology should support the national competent authority in their supervisory approach. The European methodology could support also management company and distributors in determining more accurately where their product services offer value for money. So we think that a European methodology could be very, very useful for the market, and then not necessarily an European benchmark.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Ms. Roberta Dapis.
I'm now turning to Claude de Villance from Global Product Management at CACI. So would you like to tell us more information, because there's indeed something very interesting I find, namely the issues related to data. It's a financial industry with many data. When we're looking to the players, there's an Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Saxon are prevailing, which means that their impact. So I will let you react on this fundamental subject, namely the development of this regulatory framework towards standardization of the member states. But if you could tell us more about that. Thank you. I would like to tell you more about, to be the advocate of those who are behind the scenes. Again, it means that it's another directive, another guideline. So as for regulations, the question is, are you going to give us a break over 2 or 3 years? And actually, the distribution costs have decreased. And indeed, this is correct. That's what we can see. And why? Why is it the case? Well, it's because we've invested millions on the transactions done through fax. And also, we said, we said that we actually, there's no more means to invest on all these detailed registers. Well, I partly agree. When I look into the French market, the national market in France, indeed, this is not existing. But in Luxembourg, there's a transfer register. It's something that typically we can find in the United States, in Luxembourg, in Ireland. This is not existing in other national markets. But indeed, the data, the management, the data management that we need to collect, that we need to check and transfer is indeed something that is becoming more and more prevailing. For instance, I have Luxembourg funds distributed to retail investors in South Africa, for which I'm finding myself with a register with 600,000 individuals on my database. This means that it's a lot of work when it comes to managing this database, anything related to transactions and so on. But it is very often underestimated in terms of improvement estimates and so on and so forth. So this, the Americans are quite in advance. When you look at all the American series, TV series, or when the father of the family in these series becomes retired, then he has a huge amount of funds and so on and so forth. So indeed, we're in this phase, in this stage. When I started my career 30 years ago in the registers, there was one name and one address, and the details. But now I have the name, the funds, the tax details, and also anything related to fraud and so on. So as for retail distribution, indeed, this is a challenge that we will have to face. Luckily enough, we have new technologies such as a blockchain, DLT, without, actually we don't know much about that. But potentially this will be very helpful for us to have and to maintain this database management, which is more and more prevailing, not only to face regulation, but also to help our clients, namely the asset managers, to target who are the investors, and also to build up and to develop projects that can be adapted based on the requests from the investors who are targeted. Thank you. So we are hearing this, indeed, regulation is needed. And as for the GDPR, the whole world has praised the advance, France being ahead of time. Sometimes it's a bit excessive. What do you think of that? Well, thank you, and also thank you for your invitation. I'm very pleased to be with you this morning. When it comes to retail investment strategy, I think we have to be indulgent. We have to be flexible, especially when it comes to the guidelines, And as for the MIF, the MIFID, for the last few years, this framework is being reviewed batch per batch. So we've heard on a regular basis legislative amendments that are being reflected upon, and this is being said in this discussion in order to have more retail investors towards capital markets. Indeed, there are tools that would be very efficient, but not always in the hand of the Commission. So the Commission would take into account the existing framework, and they try to reform things, trying to do bits in terms of amendments. But as for this reform at the IMF, we've been waiting for that for quite some time, for quite a long time. And I think that when MIF II came to force on the 1st of January 2018, very shortly afterwards, we started to publicly speak and say that we had to implement things quite quickly. Actually, this text is made up with several components, namely an omnibus, a so-called omnibus directive. I like this word because actually this is an omnibus in the literal and figurative meaning. Actually, this is an omnibus because it puts together a lot of ideas, claims that have accumulated over time from different backgrounds, especially the regulators. So there are many good things as far as that is concerned, especially when it comes to this omnibus. I'm not going to list all of them, but what I can say in order to illustrate what I'm saying, it's that for the last few years, we've been complaining as for the European passport is not always operating in an ideal manner. There are choices from some of the entities that are similar to, the regulatory shopping forum, for instance, that lead some of the players who have their headquarters in under jurisdiction where things are less strict, in such a way that they're to be present in where there are investors, many more investors. So this means that we were thinking, we have in mind to work on the competence authorities, the NCAs, for instance. And this is an aspect that the omnibus collectivity, so to speak, is working on, and also which is very good. And for the last few years, we have been pointing out that on the social networks, there are more and more influencers playing a role, which is quite similar to players who would be appealing investment products, and there's the border is not really clear between influencing and providing investment advice and investments, and so it wasn't really clear. But the good news is that this text is now establishing a definition as for what are the commercial practices and definitions. They are going to encompass these kind of influences, which is very good because things are going to be more clear now. And also, so far, it's been said that there are a few wages, especially when it comes to a customized investment plan that has been tested by the Commission 2 years ago. It has been given up. Well, actually, yes and no, because still there are a few things that are remaining from this project. Because it's about integrating the concept of diversification. So this is something which is being added into the text that we find is very clever, and that we do welcome. And the last item, from an administrative point of view, in France, we've worked a lot with the CCFSF as for the requirements to better harmonize the presentation of the costs at a pre-contract level, because we've realized that there are practices that are very different, and the text didn't harmonize how things are worded, are presented. And also, the terminology. So the Commission is working on this aspect as far at the moment. So these are a few examples, because actually, these aspects are not much talked about with the retrocessions, the value for money. I hope that we'll be able to discuss that further afterwards. But anyway, there are many good things done by the Commission. Karen Fiol. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm turning to you now. You're the Deputy President of the CNCGP. As for training, of course, all these topics are very interesting, and I'm sure that you have your own reflection to say on this subject. But I would like to know what is new as for training. Thank you very much. Well, training is the poor parent, so to speak, of the industry. The woman, state secretary, the background of an office anyway. But you mentioned the training. Well, actually, RIS is advice, and advice is training. So I'm not referring to financial literacy. It's another aspect. Actually, financial literacy goes through the interlocutor, the counterpart. So before talking about the RIS and training, I would like to say something as for the organization of the French market. To date, as for the fund distribution, this is being done on two chapters, two aspects. On the one hand, equity account, MIF2, MIF2, IMF, CIF, CIF, and PSI. And on the other hand, insurance, life insurance, AGAPI, PR, DDR, ACPR, and stocking. So there's a vehicle which is being privileged, that is prevailing. So the DDA part, is very much prevailing. So there are levels that are provided by the regulation in France. It's very structured. There's a level of degree which is required for brokering. And IMF has stipulated that since 2010 that there should be a certificate, IMF certificate. Actually, it shouldn't be a certificate. This shouldn't be this way. Because actually, it's a test on minimum knowledge in such a way that there's a common knowledge, whether you're in a management company or in financial advice entity, which is my case. So on the one hand, you have the DDA with insurance, where you have there's a degree which is the level of degree is less, a lower level of degree is required. But why am I telling you all this? Well, actually, it's because the French market is structured. Well, indeed, there are things that can be improved, but I can say that indeed, let's say that the French system is structured. At the RIS, it's about mainly ongoing training. namely the RRS retail investment strategy. It's about ongoing training. That's what we heard on a regular basis. But actually, I would like to say that it's misleading. It's wrong because ongoing training is very important. It's paramount. However, as among the amendments that have been submitted, there are 30 hours of training, ongoing training per week. Another amendment, 35 hours, including sustainable finance. Another one is 45 hours. So when it comes, to inflation, we can go infinitely. Another rapporteur says, well, actually, it's 25 hours, including 7 in sustainable finance. Well, okay, sustainable finance. It's not about. It's not ongoing. Ongoing training is not going to solve the problems, the issues related to sustainable finance. It's not ongoing training. We need a strong initial training. This is required. So we need to put that in place. We should discuss this. Of course, the world is not perfect, but that's a kind of a time of inertia, and we should seize the opportunity of this moment, of this period, in order to train people to have a strong initial training. So let's come back to IMF. Is it because I'm a part of the HCCP? Maybe, but the IMF since 2022 has developed a test, has designed a test on sustainable finance. So of course it's not perfect, and nothing is perfect. But the question is, instead of imposing ongoing training on SFDF, why not imposing rather instead an strong initial training, whether it is about DDA or CIF, PSI. Let's come back to the RAIS, retail investment strategies. So very honestly, I think that Europe is wrong, is misled in increasing the quota when it comes to ongoing training. On the contrary, I think that we should focus on initial training of the advisors, because when there's a European level set of very well-trained advisors, there will be fewer regulatory taxes afterwards. When it comes to France, I think it would be good also, but this is a very pious wish. It would be good that France is not misled in thinking that it's about investing funds in an equity account or in life insurance. I think it would be good to go back to good sense. Anybody would like to react on that? I think that there are other subjects that are very interesting. Well, Alexandra, I will come back to you, because when it comes to financial industry, it's about a finance economy. As for asset management, it's a strategic pillar, it's a strategic aspect of, when it comes to competition, so on and so forth, when it comes to fund economy, green transition, so on and so forth. So it's about also, what about the funding levers? Can you tell us more about that? The industry of asset management is a key element in the chain between the investors' savings and also, on the other hand, the needs in fundings. And as far as that is concerned, we need private funds, private investments in order to fund innovation, culture innovation, so on and so forth, to fund companies, whether they are SMEs and so on and so forth, they're very small businesses and so on and so forth. So when it comes to tackle this huge diversity in funding needs, we need, as we said earlier, a big diversity of funds, of products that would cover all this range. And if we make a link with the RIS, it's also about now about the value for money. And the concept for value for money is in line with what we're doing. But the European Commission is offering something else, namely the ESMA commissioned to create a group in order to compare a fund with others. As for all these, especially the peer groups, for instance, the average charges, the performances, but on the basis of these benchmarks, each management company should determine whether their project is aligned with the benchmarks or going away from this benchmark. And if it's the case, it would be about justifying the reason why they are going away from the benchmarks. But this raises many questions. First, comment. This is very similar to a form of price framing. Also, when it comes to methodology, first thing, the approach proposed is pan-European. But as this was said beforehand, the products from a jurisdiction from another can be different, especially when it comes to the other funds where the regulations are national. The investment rules are such that the products can have different features, different characteristics, which is not possible because then you know how to compare things from one jurisdiction with another one. So this is this pan-European aspect, but also, and second, this top-down approach, because it's about commissioning the ESMA to have these groups. And we know that at the European level, there are many products, more than 66,000 funds that are offered, that are opened and accessible to people, to investors. So actually, we should have precise peer groups and granularity peer groups. This is not a theory because we can see already at the national level with the benchmarks, with the prices as for unit accounts, and we can see that the different categories are quite wide. And for instance, we have such, for example, assets of all kinds, shares of all kinds that are put into the same basket with small caps, big caps, and so on and so forth. And we're going to compare funds with active mixed funds and so on and so forth. But all these will lead to products that don't have the same features, the same characteristics, and logically they won't have the same level of costs. And this can be explained, of course, but with a single unit, with different categories that are not granulary, well, this may risk the removal of from the market products that are more standardized. So the risk for this system is to have a standardization of offer over time, and this would result in gaps in funding in the economy as well. So this is the system as it is imagined by the European Commission. Based on this, with our working group commission, we've worked a lot on this topic and we are still doing so, and this leads us to this counter proposal. As this was said several times by Roberta earlier, the value for money should be at several levels. It should cover all the value chain, whether it is about the producers and also the distributors, especially when it comes to the distribution costs. Another key element as for our counter proposal is that we should give more margin for maneuver to the market players for them to be able to put in place their system, namely to leave the investment management companies to build themselves the peer groups, because who can be better than the manager to be able to do these things? And this is what we are suggesting. Also, it's up to the manager, to this manager, to define how to compare his or her product to the others, to what to other groups. Because it's indeed a case-by-case approach. This being said, this doesn't mean that there are no rules whatsoever, because indeed it would be very logical and sound that there is a European framework that would define a minimum basis, minimum foundations, minimum criteria that would be common to all the market players in such a way that the approach is as harmonized, as unified as possible. Next, obviously, and this is not a new proposal that we are suggesting. It's actually the normal flow of a regulated company, of a management company, namely all the diligences done in terms of value for money aim at being procedured, and also they have to be they are aimed to be documented and tracked. So there's more responsibility on the different players, but this doesn't mean that it's negative at all. It can be about internal players, as for instance, those are controlling compliance and so on and so forth. But all this can be controlled and supervised by or monitored by the national players. And another suggestion from us, it's to involve strongly the governance from these management companies into these different systems, not only before the approval of the procedures at the level of the IMF, and then it would be good if this entity could apply the procedure and as for the funds that have been approved, and so on. So this is the summary of my proposal. Indeed, we should give the floor to the different players. I'm sure you have many things to say. Indeed, I have a lot of. A huge amount of data that you will have to manage. As for the influencers, I'm thinking, well, if there's a guy who's paid in Brussels to watch videos, it must be very interesting. Yes, but social networks are present everywhere. These shouldn't be neglected. Sometimes, we do react to what some of the influencers would post. But, it was noticed and quite positively. Very well. Now let's go back to these value for money related data. You've clarified very well the granularity into which we should enter in order to determine a rate or information that would be provided to the investors. But however, I'm worried on the following things. As a value, not everyone has the same value. We heard recently, well, we need ESG criteria because otherwise, the Z generation wouldn't be willing to remain on the same funds and so on and so forth. Well, I think that indeed we've seen an increase in the investment funds. In the American markets, things are slightly decreasing. So, okay, let's wait and see. And also, the market is changing very quickly. Quite recently, the rate was negative. So having a return published, and actually I was asked to develop in my systems negative yields for money market that were considered as refuge values. So I know that I'm going to lose money for some time, but at least I know that it's more or less secured. Shouldn't we? Because actually, are things going to be stabilized? Well, I think that there will be a lot of data with which we'll have to manage. And when I'm referring to the RIS, I mean education. As for education, indeed, there's a role of advisor and also trade execution. As for advisor, we want to have production, investments, and so on and so forth. It's considered as being the noble function of the distributor. And as for trade execution, which is my side. Of course, it's a bit expensive, and it's normal that but who says that advisement is a key function whilst the trade execution is not that important? Well, I'm not sure that the situation in which we are is made up with a noble part of the execution and another one, because when I want to buy a car, I know which car I want to buy. So despite the advisor to do research, what I'm interested in is the manufacturing, the delivery, and the car to meet my expectations. Anyway, Charles, did you want to add something, especially when it comes to RIS and so on? Well, actually, I'm definitely in line with what Frédéric said, the value for money and, the industry in general, because indeed nobody can disagree with this. And as citizens, we're in an industry with specificities, namely the management costs are not visible. It's a bit like a VAT. You pay that, but it's not hurtful, so to speak, than paying the taxes. So anyway, I think it's not about being an advocate on the industry. I think it's more about the benchmarks, because I would like to wish a lot of courage to Mr. Baratelli and his teams, given the context, the diversity of the funds. And I can imagine that ESMA has, depending on the locations, the countries, and, active or passive management of assets. So, well, both have advantages and drawbacks. But when detailing things, we very quickly realize that there's a huge diversity in things, especially when we want to create huge categories. For instance, active management of European assets. You can do that based on geography. But if you're looking into funds with management costs of 0.60 and so on, it's more expensive than a fund with 1% of management cost. It's the remuneration risk compared to price risk. And if it's not good, the result is disappearing. When it comes to active management, European assets, I'll say that amongst with similar fees, it's about when selling value management to clients, it's not possible to resist, to survive in a growth context which is not that good. Especially when between 2009 and 2021, things will be overperformed.
Quand on se compare en termes de.
You make comparisons in terms of marketing, and you see different types of know-how. You have different types of methodologies. But I'm very much afraid if ever we become standardized, that might not be good. But what about the distributor? He has a certain leeway if the funds follows the benchmarks. If it's justified in doing so, it can keep its referencing. In view of the big number of funds and accounts, and if we look at the different resources and the times involved, if the benchmarks aren't complied with, then there's a problem. Then there are regulatory risks. Who's going to take regulatory risks, even if they're justified? And there are uncertainties. The regulator might not have the same opinion that you have, so there could be a regulatory or commercial risk. So it is certain. And we have a share manager who's very active. And the aim is not to give the figures here, but have a good performance rate. If you take a lot of risks, there are periods during which it's more difficult. Whenever risk managers have underperform, there's a whole waltz that goes on. Some funds have suffered over the past years from this, but sometimes it's the best. It can be a good moment to invest. But there's a risk. You might become totally standardized. Everything's watered down, and that's not beneficial for investors. So as value for money, we're more worried about the definition of value than that of money.
I don't know if you want to add something, a conclusion word, Ms. Roberta Dapis. Otherwise, it's okay.
Value for money is obviously a topic, an important topic for the market. It is important. It is only important to link with the best of interest text because we have to increasing the trust of the investor, and so how to value proposition is communicated, explained to the investor is very, very important.
Yeah, thank you, Madame Fiol. Je ne sais pas si brièvement vous avez.
Now, maybe you'd like to conclude. You've been listening carefully. This is the right time. It's coffee break time. Where you can talk to our panelists, and they deserve a round of applause.
An open window on the world. Following the sun at any time and any place. Illuminating innovation constantly. Offering solidly anchored solutions. Sharing expertise in partnership. Follow your ambitions. Discover cases. Cases, solid and innovative.